I want to talk about tobacco and its influence and origins in Jamestown, and it is considered a saving grace for it because it saved it from a lot of economic ruin and really changed the state of the colony. So firstly, what is Jamestown? So Jamestown is most noted for being the first colony in the New World, and the New World is called so because the Western Hemisphere was previously undiscovered by the English. So the land was a mystery to the English and home to the indigenous people. They called it new because it's just simply something that they were not knowledged on. It was also started by the Virginia Company, who sponsored the starting of this. The Virginia Company sent some English colonists to Virginia to start up this Jamestown. They were looking for gold. Another big thing that we know is that the environment of Jamestown was really unfamiliar to these colonists. They were looking for gold, they just wanted profit, so they didn't really know exactly what they were in for just yet before going. So one big thing that we know that is very common knowledge is that Jamestown had a lot of deaths going on. And towards the beginning of Jamestown, there was a lot of economic failure and people were really struggling to make ends meet. So firstly, the environment is a huge part of this. Firstly, it was swampy, it was very humid, it was extremely hot, and the winters were just as extreme as how hot it was in the summer. There was also brackish water. Brackish water is basically when the water is saltier than fresh water, so it's not something that is very ideal to drink. And additionally, there were also droughts, which made farming and it was just difficult to get access to good water. And so some problems that they faced, climate, which was kind of a domino into a lot of other problems. So the climate also contributed to the spread of diseases. So first, one disease that it caused was dysentery. And dysentery is involved with digestion, and it's the infection of intestines which can result in severe diarrhea with the presence of blood and mucus in the feces. There was also typhoid, which is the lack of vitamin C, and it can have some pretty negative consequences on the body. And both of these had the side effects of anorexia, which was a huge reason why starvation was a big problem. And starvation is because there were a lack of preparations to find food, and it was overall pretty difficult to find ways to find fresh food. There was also some cases where people believe, well, it did happen, these colonists would resort to very desperate measures and they would resort to cannibalism. And yeah, then there's the lack of peace that happened. So another reason why the death toll was so high was because Indians would often attack Jamestown settlers. And historians estimate that approximately 350 to 400 of the 1,200 settlers were killed. Peace between the Powhatan Indians and the English did not last long because there was an attempt to kidnap Pocahontas by the English in return for English prisoners and weapons that the Powhatan had held. So Jamestown was attacked by the Powhatan Indians for many years after, and they retaliated and fought with the Indians for many years to come. So with these conditions adding up, we can conclude that Jamestown was not an ideal place to live with its low survivability and little profit. Also, there's a lot of thinking that laziness was what killed the settlers. They thought that settlers were really lazy, too lazy to get their work done, but many claim that it's actually not exactly laziness. Their laziness is a side effect of one of the diseases that they went through. So writings show that malnutrition often led the colonists' death, as people that were victims of nutritional deficiency disease, which was very common, displayed signs of lethargy and anorexia. Victims would have too little energy to get up and act, and they insisted on staying idle in the comfort of their beds. This laziness was a symptom of malnutrition. Therefore, saying that colonists died from laziness is a bit too far of a jump, I believe. Historian Cooperman said that the word laziness comes up again and again, which is remarkable about Jamestown, is that a number of people are said to have died of laziness. So it wasn't exactly laziness, it was the idleness that was catalyzed by the malnutrition epidemic raging through Jamestown. And like I said earlier, this anorexia was often a side effect of another underlying disease, like scurvy. Scurvy is by far the most identified disease that the colonists faced, which is caused by the lack of vitamin C. So what really changed everything, what changed everything for the better, was the introduction of tobacco. So John Rolfe, he was sent to Jamestown on a new charter sent by the Virginia Company, and he is also credited with the saving of Jamestown. Here's this quote. Here, I'll go for Ralph Hammer. I may not forget the gentleman worthy of much recommendations, which first took the pains to make trial thereof, his name Mr. John Rolfe, Anno Domini 1612, partly for the love he hath a long time borne unto it, and partly to raise commodity to the adventures. That is Ralph Hammer, the Secretary of Virginia. So he credits John Rolfe for what he did, and he thinks that he's worthy of the praise for his actions. So what he did was that he basically introduced tobacco to Jamestown, and it is said that he found these seeds in the Caribbean, specifically Trinidad, and he also experimented with these seeds in the Jamestown environment. So based on his experience, he deducted that Jamestown was the perfect environment to grow the crop. So Jamestown was really marshy, swampy, humid, and so that was the very ideal environment. And he sent his first batch of tobacco that he grew to England, and it got a lot of positive reviews. So basically, he knew that Jamestown was in a rough situation. He saw that people were trying to make silk, glass, soap. All of these efforts, however, were never enough to pull a profit, and these would never be as successful as what the influence of tobacco would bring. And so here's a quote from John Rolfe himself. Likewise tobacco, which there thrives so well that no doubt but after a little more trial and experience in the curing thereof, it will compare with the best in the West Indies. So the sales. By 1630, over 1.5 million pounds of tobacco was exported from Jamestown annually. The success of tobacco made the economy greatly improved, since their slow beginnings in the colonists were finally able to make good profit for the Virginia Company, who had initially sent the colonists over to Virginia in hopes for good profit. So 50,000 pounds were sold to Spain alone, and there was just a lot of high demand for Jamestown-specific tobacco because it was just a really booming business, and it brought crazy economic success. So because there was so much of a demand for all of this tobacco, people really did need a good source of labor, and they wanted this labor to be accessible. They wanted it to be cheap. So Jamestown needed to produce more, which consequently resulted in the need for even more laborers. So the go-to source for labor was indentured servants, as they were seen as cheap labor. These indentured servants would work for plantation owners for 4 to 7 years under the condition that the owners would pay for their trip to Virginia, When people saw the New World, they believed that they would be blessed with many more opportunities in terms of jobs, life, and wealth. However, it was a long trip, so some people could not afford to even pay the fees to travel from the United Kingdom to America. So people were willing to work as laborers for long hours and little pay just to travel. So African slaves were also widely used in the plantations as well. Indentured servants and slaves were treated with the same freedom opportunities at the time because slave laws didn't exist yet. Indentured servants often had to work in harsh conditions, constantly overworking themselves with little rest and long hours of work. So not only were conditions harsh, but the laborers were earning so little as their pay was very limited. For a while, indentured servitude is seen as a death trap because a good majority of them died before their contracts would even expire, so they wouldn't even be able to experience that freedom that they essentially worked so hard for. The mortality rates was extremely high. Masters were really cruel to their laborers, and this undoubtedly shaved off many years from their lives. Some servants would be severely beaten if they didn't meet their owner's standards, to the point that they would become disabled and they might even die. According to the historian Edmund Sears Morgan, Virginians began looking for, yearned for a cheaper, more docile, and more stable supply of labor, while their servants loafed on the job, ran away, and claimed the traditional long lunch hour. Eventually, indentured servants began to decrease in numbers as slaves became more abundant for lower prices. And by the middle of the 18th century, Africans became the main members of the labor force as the world's supply of slaves spiked in availability. And thank you for listening. That is my presentation.